Hello, everybody. Today is just one of my favorite days. We're talking to one of the greats from Enverus. My name is Stu Turley, President and CEO of the Sandstone Group, and we're taking a little bit of time to visit with our friend Maxwell Ryan. He is in the Power and Renewables division over there at Enverus. So thank you, Maxwell, for stopping by the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Stu. Excited to be here.
Boy, you sure don't sound excited. I mean, that was about the most monotone I've ever heard from you there.
Oh yeah. Well, we'll see where this goes, but I'm looking forward to our conversation today. It should be exciting and entertaining.
Okay, well, for our listeners, both of my fans that are out there, we were just kind of sitting. This is Maxwell's first podcast, so we're going to have a little bit of a fun at your expense, and all that kind of stuff. So tell us a little bit. You've been at Enverus for about 18 months. Tell us what you're doing there and everything that's going on in your power and renewable section.
Yeah, so been in Varus since early 2021. Right now, the Power and Renewables group is growing pretty quickly. We've made 2 acquisitions in the last, year and a half. And really what we're trying to do is stand up a new group here focused on mainly domestic power and renewables as a whole. And so we think about it in a few different ways. We've got a load tool, load forecasting tool. We've got congestion analytics tool, and then we've got a tool that focuses on kind of macro data, so power plants, power delivery, and power pricing.
Okay.
And yeah,
let's go ahead and back up just a little bit. You say load balancing and everything else. So if you're talking wind and solar, you're going to have to balance those kind of things out. Tell us a little bit more about that technology.
Yeah, so PRT or pattern recognition technology. So we've got a couple different unique tools there. So we've got, kind of ISO level public load forecasting. So how much load do we think is going to be online in different ISOs or different regions or zones in those ISOs? And then we also have kind of private load models. So for utilities, they're trying to understand when they look out, a few days forward in their service territory, what's the expectation of load. So a lot of entities who are either scheduling power or trading power really want to understand the load profiles in different regions to understand likely what prices could look like and which generators would or wouldn't come online in those different scenarios.
So your clients for your product are the energy companies, correct?
Yeah, so it's quite broad, but anyone who is focused on power would be a client of ours, right? So from a kind of an operational standpoint, those could be developers of gas plants or wind plants or solar plants. They could be owners or operators, or they could be people who we consider to be service providers or goods providers, right? So EPC firms, O&M firms, law firms, and banks.
With our 3 grids in the US, you have ERCOT, which has a wonderful reputation right now. And then you have the other 2. How does all that play together with the communication? So do you communicate between all 3 grids, or how does all that play together?
Yeah, so we look at data from all 3 grids, right? So obviously we're focused across the US, both in regulated and deregulated markets, at collecting as much information as possible to help companies that are either sort of strategically planning to enter a new market or operate in a new market, or could be actually in that market today and are thinking about how to operate those assets.
Okay. And so when you sit back and take a look, how would data, if you're looking at entering into a energy sector, how can Enverus's data help you decide whether you want to enter or not enter?
Yeah, so, it can be tricky, right? There's obviously a lot of different types of entities that are thinking about this. If you come at it from an operator's perspective versus maybe an investor's perspective, that's one way to think about it, right? So for an operator, understanding, strategically, is there opportunity here from potentially a policy perspective, right? Like, is policy favorable or unfavorable for whatever technology it is I'm building, right? So we're kind of agnostic to if you're building a gas plant or a wind plant or a solar plant or a battery, especially nowadays, right? And so favorable or unfavorable both historically, current, and potentially in the future, right? So we're seeing obviously changes in policies happening quite quickly, and those can be down to the local level, right? You're seeing local jurisdictions saying potentially no more of these technology types in our backyard. And then obviously at the federal level, you're having, if you build this plant here, you will get, tax incentives. So that seems to be a really good place to start is, is this opportunity favorable or not for us? As you start to zoom in from that perspective, you start to look at all these different data sets that, one, are pretty fragmented, and two, can be very, can lack transparency. And so when we think about generators, transmission lines, substation, pricing, understanding, okay, what does my competition look like? What does my opportunity look like here from a revenue perspective? Will my plant even be able to plug into the grid, right? If I were to build something here, those are just some of the different ways that you can use the data in all these different markets to understand, should I be here or not?
So you're talking real market intelligence, trying to go through and figure out what you want to get into from a business perspective.
Correct.
Wow, that's pretty darn cool. Now I'm impressed with the electricity here in Texas, because I can sit there and look at my bill and it tells you the kilowatt per hour, and you owe, like last winter, $2,000 a minute, whatever the horrible number was, because the horrible problem. But I love, as a consumer, being able to shop kilowatt per hour. I also love being able to see, what my actual bill is before it gets here. Not all power companies have that kind of ability.
Yeah, so I'm here in Denver, Colorado, and every month I look at my utility bill and I just pay it, right? It's I just have one provider, and in some ways it's funny because when you don't have optionality, you just deal with it, and it's fine. And then obviously yourself and many others that I work with and I know that live in Texas, some of them do not like having that ability, right, to float around and find new providers. But then I have others that I know that love it, right? And they, a good friend of mine said the other day, when I get, the alert from my demand response, I just turn the air off and, I walk down the street to get a cold beverage and I get to save money, right? And so it's very interesting that depending on the market you're in, you may have options or not, and you may or may not want those options.
Well, there was an article that came out the other day on, I think it was just a couple of days ago. Texas was put out a big note and said, "Oh, everybody turn off your power. It's going to be really bad." And so there was an article that came out from Australia, maybe it was even yesterday. And they said, "Oh, the Bitcoin farms turned green and they turned off the power off the grid to save Texas's power." And I'm like, all right, was that somebody's bubblegum machine or something? Because I know Bitcoin miners and they're going to leave those pieces of equipment on. So is Bitcoin mining something that you can differentiate? Well, I can't even talk. But can you break that out of the your data sets and say, hey, this company is actually doing Bitcoin mining, or is that something you even care about?
Yeah, so it can be challenging to break out like where load exists inside of a grid. Like obviously we know load centers, right? Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, right? But for an individual that maybe has built a mine somewhere kind of off on the grid, it can be challenging. One thing that's been really interesting, I think, is that the Bitcoin mining community, ERCOT and Texas as a whole have been very pro, bring your Bitcoin mines to ERCOT, and a lot of them are being set up out west, right, where prices are significantly lower, right? And so it's a really nice opportunity for them and other industries to take advantage of that kind of price arbitrage. My understanding is a lot of these Bitcoin mining operations have been working with ERCOT to be willing to kind of
shut down
or at least lower their load profile in times of scarcity and sort of demand reserves are shrinking. And so it'll be really interesting. I'm sure there'll be some data that comes out probably sooner than later, but definitely by the end of the summer, where we get a better sense of, are they actually doing that or not? And how is that, positively or negatively impacting the grid?
In looking at the new administration rules and everything else, they're kind of saying that natural gas is now a renewable. I mean, that was kind of fun when they said, oh, it's available for ESG funding. And then, you take a look at the line production or the line performance of a nuke, and it's just flat line. It's got steady power going on. You have the solar, you have the wind and everything else. What are you seeing on the nuclear front as far as being a base load for your site and everything else? How does that fit into the renewable section?
Yeah, I think, we really only have one data point right now. In Georgia, they're building a big plant Vogel. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this plant.
I'm not, let me know.
It's approaching a decade late, and I think 2.5 times cost overrun.
Nice.
And so I think the challenge is, nuclear is a hot button issue for many, right?
Right.
Obviously, a lot of people look at it as, call it net zero emissions. So when we think about the future of energy or energy transition, it could be very powerful from that perspective. There's obviously many who have seen some of the tragedies around some of the nuclear facilities historically as well, right? And so, obviously, I think that from a baseload perspective, it's an interesting option. I think the challenge is going to be politically and regionally who will push for it, and we just haven't seen that yet.
Well, on storage, so everybody sits back also in Texas versus Denver. Wind is not always going to be a good option for different areas. And I keep bringing back to Texas because until ERCOT had the real problems, nobody even knew that so much of it was wind. What are you seeing coming around the corner on storage? Because storage is so expensive, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And what's really interesting too is like a lot of these technologies are very early in their life cycle, right? So with any technology, hardware specifically, if you look back, whatever, 20 years ago, computers were significantly more expensive than they are today, right? Or even cell phones. And so I think what we're seeing, and wind and solar are a good example of this, is call it just over a decade ago, the cost of those technologies has come down significantly, somewhere between 70 and 90% between the two of them. And so with storage being incredibly new, in a decade or so, if we see those cost reductions, this looks very different than if we do not, right? And so obviously outside of a lot of the supply chain challenges pushing prices up across the board for all commodities, it will be really interesting to see how quickly or how steep that decline is. So that's one piece of the equation. The other piece is right now, you're looking at duration, in the hours, right? So 2-4 hours really, some slightly higher. And so if you start to talk about long duration solar or long duration storage actually working, that really changes the paradigm here, right? So if you could store for a day or a week or a season, all of a sudden, certain seasons in Texas are significantly windier than others. And so you could start to say, we're going to store this wind power for the summer when it's not as windy as it is in the fall or in the spring. And so, storage could be the key to some of the long-term, mid to long-term, we're talking decades, right? Opportunity to push the kind of the renewables piece forward, if you want to say. But I think it's really interesting because there's really only a couple, there's not much, very many megawatts online, like in ERCOT, for example. But when we look at what's planned, and we can stay in ERCOT specifically, the kind of growth in the interconnection queue, so the planned assets, the solar and batteries have really taken over from wind, right? And so what the market is saying is there will be more of these in the future. Obviously, solar is more kind of helpful in that the load profile and the solar generation profile, they have a higher correlation, right, than wind. And so that's one piece of it. But if you tie that in with the batteries, it gives you more of a chance to get towards what I like to think of as like a 24/7 type product, right? And so is it a 24/7 type clean product? Is it just a 24/7 product that you have a really nice mix of
Right.
wind, solar, gas, and batteries,
Yep.
with some nuclear and coal, depending on the market. Yeah, I think really what this comes down to is it's all going to be regionally based, right? Some regions,
Right.
wind doesn't make sense. Some regions, solar doesn't make sense. If you go to the Northwest, hydro dominates, right? And so what I think is in the future, you'll see regionally specific policy and technologies dominate,
Right.
especially as you see some of these technologies mature over time.
Maxwell, a couple things when you sit back and take a look, it's all about, just as we were talking about low kilowatt per hour to the consumer. And you take a look, California is number 3, actually, I believe, in the US for high kilowatt per hour. There are 2 other little small regions up back east. And part of that, I believe, is because they have to import either LNG or other things from up in that area in order to do some of their power and all that. So there's a little bit of a difference, but or the non-windies or the non-solars say that solar is way more expensive, and that's why it's so expensive. So if everybody's saying the price of wind and solar is coming down, how come there are tax things that are required for it? And we're just trying to figure, my head explodes. I mean, I feel like I just want to, what is your thoughts on the high cost of kilowatt per hour? Because my head explodes every time I want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think I get where you're headed. I think
before or after I exploded.
Yeah. The incentives, the PTC and the ITC exist for wind and solar, right? And those can be hot button topics, right? For people who want to see the technology stand on their own, right?
Right.
The sense I've gotten is, the government has made, call it investments in technologies going back, decades or centuries to help us as a society, kind of move in different directions or be more efficient, right? And so, we have seen, for example, the price of like power purchase agreements. So, for example, the offtake of a wind or solar plant, they've come down into numbers that are fairly cost competitive with all existing technologies. And when you look at them, like the first PPAs in California, over a decade ago, were like in the $200 per megawatt hour, and we've seen some signed, late last year that were in the 20s and even in the 30s, right? So, obviously, I think there will be a time where these incentives roll off and the technologies will be forced to compete without them. But that is not something that I'm focused on. We're focused more on how do we build products to let people make good decisions no matter which policies are in place. And our focus is more on that piece of it than having a thought on if the policy makes sense or not necessarily.
Oh, I like it. Great answer. But I'm coming back to the same kind of thing. How in the world are you guys able to factor in the supply chain issues? Because that's going to drive the price up for almost everything. I mean, so how do you factor in, the supply chain? Because we may or may not get solar panels from China, or we may or may not get those kind of things. How's the supply chain figuring out for Maxwell for all your calculations? I use a crayon. So.
Yeah, supply chain is a challenge, right? Not specifically, I think, in the way that you asked it, but what we're seeing, and obviously, I think you were referencing the solar tariff circumvention petition that's in front of the Commerce Department right now, and obviously, that needs to have a resolution, because I think with all businesses, right, uncertainty is the biggest challenge, right? Is that without certainty, be it that they say they're going to do nothing or they're going to do something, people just want to know what it looks like moving forward. And so what we're seeing is, like, obviously there's just supply chain challenges across the board, right? Like every industry is seeing, and that's potentially slowing down and slightly increasing the cost. We haven't seen cost come up too high from the companies that we've talked to. A lot of the OEMs, so the equipment manufacturers, they've just really been trying to use efficiencies to cut out as much of that supply chain cost, especially since a lot of those contracts were signed,
Right.
multiple years ago. But around the Commerce Department piece, like, yeah, the market needs to understand what that decision will be, ideally sooner than later, for companies to get comfortable with making decisions, themselves, right? And I think that's something that, everyone in the market is watching very closely, is, what will happen here,
Right.
be it a decision to do nothing or to do something, but when is it likely that we'll actually see a decision?
Maxwell, in taking a look at the market right now, it just seems like we just all can't get along. You have these people over here. If you were not running for president or something, but what are some of the things that you would change in the discussion points to try to get everybody on the same power wagon?
Yeah, I guess, when you say we don't get along, what do you mean by that?
Well, when people either they're diehard wind and solar, or they're oil and gas, and then they don't like either camp. And so what I'm trying to say is, I guess the good question would be, in educating people in energy, what would you do differently?
Yeah, I think, that's interesting. So obviously, before I was working at a company that was mostly just focused on power, but even more specifically renewables, right? And now
Right.
being at Enverus, which is well-known oil and gas, software platform. I think what I would say is that the best thing is for everyone to have an open mind,
Right.
and be willing to come to any conversation that you're having with someone, willing to at least hear their position. And even if you don't agree with their position, if you can have
An open mind.
a legitimate conversation about the pros and cons to both sides, and understand that ultimately we're going to probably end up somewhere in the middle. That's really the way to move forward, right? And there is opportunities, I think, for both sides to be incredibly successful as the energy evolution and the energy mix changes, and
Very
that
good.
one side really shouldn't be going necessarily after the other. They should be focusing on their specific parts of the business and how they can kind of move what they're looking to accomplish forward.
Excellent answer, because I actually kind of threw that curveball at you intentionally just to kind of see what you'd be coming back with, and you did outstanding.
What do you think, Stu? I'd love
Oh,
to hear your opinion on that.
Well, that's even better. Asking another question back. I love it. And so one of the fun things is, why can't we just talk together? And Maxwell, you answered it greatly. Let's have an intelligent conversation. And I think, in my opinion, we need to use power to get everyone elevated out of poverty. Let's deliver the lowest kilowatt per hour using the best source with the least amount of impact on the environment. So in order to do that, you need to use all forms of energy, but let the market decide which one uses it. So take away tax incentives and let's use the cheapest energy source to get the disproportionately impacted communities the power that they need at the lowest cost, and the disproportionately impacted countries. And it's amazing what energy has done for elevating people out of poverty. So I'm for all kinds of power, because we're going to need all kinds of power. It doesn't matter if it's solar, wind, nuclear, but let's get the lowest kilowatt to everybody, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I do. And I think, thinking linearly can be very challenging, right? And it's okay to get a few steps ahead of yourself to understand the future may look different than it is today. Yep. And how long that takes and who is involved will be really interesting, right? We've seen a huge sort of push from, like, I would say, like the macro, technically, like historically oil and gas companies are becoming, they're calling themselves energy companies, right? And
Right.
Some people have said, that's really good. We think that's a great idea. Other people have said you should just focus on being an oil and gas company, right? And so
Right.
What will be really interesting is, should the largest oil and gas companies just do what they've done forever, or should they try to transition themselves? And I think, like you said, the market will always win. Like free
Right.
markets usually determine the best outcomes over time, right? And this is
Right.
not something that will happen in 1 year or 5 years or 10 years. Like this is a multi-decade type of problem. And so if you and I were to talk in, call it 2042,
Right.
I would imagine that our conversation will look very different. And I think it will be exciting to see what happens between now and then as people push different technologies and as money continues to flow into the space. There's a lot of R&D happening, both on like the legacy side around carbon capture and emission reduction of legacy kind of oil and gas type businesses, but then also on things like we talked about, like long duration storage and solar and wind technologies, and even some sort of technologies like hydrogen or fusion, et cetera, right?
Well, Maxwell, I just really have enjoyed our conversation. Yeah, for the first podcast that you've been on, I hope you set the bar really low, so the next ones that you go on are going to be actually wonderful compared to this one. But what's next for Maxwell coming around the corner at Enverus? What do you see coming around the corner for you?
Yeah, I think our goal is to continue to sort of integrate the businesses that we have today, right? So
Right.
we've got 3 sort of distinct businesses that we're beginning to integrate together. And what we're excited about is the ability to take different sort of analysis or analytics that
Right.
were focused on one type of cohort or one type of end user, have a lot of functionality and optionality through the market. So that's really where we're focused right now, is like, how do we expand what we've done inside these individual businesses as a group?
Right.
And then moving forward, Enverus as a whole is very aggressive on the M&A front. So we're looking to find other businesses that we think complement what we're doing. And what our goal ultimately is that we believe that if you're focused on power at all, that we have a solution or solutions that would help your business grow.
I think well said, Maxwell. You just hit it out of the park. So thank you very much for stopping by the Energy News Beat podcast. I do appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Stu. I look forward to coming back someday.
Oh, you bet. We'll see you again soon.